Thank you for coming here to CSIS. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I oversee our defense and national security work here at CSIS as the director of the National Security Program. I am not John Hamre, who was trapped in the Midwest travel delays for the holiday weekend. So with apologies that John couldn't be here, I'll be introducing the conference today. So our Global Security Forum, this is the 9th year that we've done this forum with the generous support of Leonardo DRS. And we've decided this year to do things a little differently, and we've been really pleased with how this has gone. Instead of doing a completely open format, we decided instead to do a 3-phased approach. We had a phase 1 that was an experts workshop that we hosted in September along the same theme as today's public event, and to build, if you will, the intellectual capital for today's event. So that experts workshop had 70 participants. The report that you have around the table that will brief to you today was derived from that event, and it lists the participants in the back of that, so you can see who participated. That's also available, that report, online. Today is phase 2, which is the public-facing part of our Global Security Forum. In addition to the intro remarks here, we'll have an armchair discussion between myself and Admiral Mike Rogers. We'll have a brief presentation, as I said, of our report and some of the takeaways from that report. We will be premiering some videos that try to capture and educate on issues of gray zone challenges, and we'll close out with an expert panel moderated by CSIS's Heather Conley, who's also the author of the Kremlin Playbook. That will feature David Cohen, former deputy of the CIA, deputy director of CIA. It'll have Suzanne Spaulding, who is here at CSIS and is a former undersecretary at DHS. It'll have Ambassador Derek Mitchell, now the president of the National Democratic Institute, and Tom Wright from Brookings, who's the director of the Center on the United States and Europe. Without further delay, let me, though, introduce our great sponsor for this and for all of the Global Security Forums of the past, and that's Bill Lynn, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Leonardo DRS. Please join me in welcoming Bill.
Thanks very much, Kath, and let me join Kath and the now sleeping, I think, John Hamre, who finally got in, I think, at 4 in the morning last night. This, as Kath said, is the 9th year that we've sponsored this. It's been a constant with CSIS. We've gone from FinMechanica to Leonardo DRS as we've evolved here in the U.S. market, but we're very pleased to sponsor this event. As Kath said, it's shifted, but in terms of format, but it's constant in terms of its ability to address the issues in national security that are most up front. And you'll see that again, I think, today as you start with the cyber domain and Admiral Rogers, and then talk about hybrid warfare and more gray zone conflicts that are coming to dominate our national security challenges. We've been extremely pleased with the results of these forums and the way that they've led the debate here in Washington, and I know we're going to see another year where that's true again. So again, we're pleased to be sponsoring this, and thank you for coming, and let me turn it back to Kath.
Again, a huge thanks to our sponsors at Leonardo DRS, who have been incredibly helpful in allowing us to explore new approaches to this forum. We've been really, again, pleased with the quality of the work we've been able to do under this new format. And we're going to show you some of that today. Again, a lot more multimedia than we've used in the past, a lot more behind-the-scenes research efforts that you'll get to see highlighted alongside the public part, which we think is so much a part of our responsibility as a 501c3 nonprofit to bring issues of national security into the public space. I want to say a special thanks to those who've done so much work to arrange today. Michael Matlaga has run everything relating to the Global Security Forum, and John Schaus, who's in the back, and I'm sorry I can't see, oh, Michael's back there too, has overseen, directed, and produced the videos and done so much of the other work for us. So without further ado, we're going to bring on a video that just introduces the topic of gray zone challenges, and then Admiral Rogers and I will begin our back and forth dialogue in which we'll invite you to ask questions.
The United States faces more challenges in more places than ever. Almost every day, Americans are reminded that our current world is increasingly complex, technology-driven, and interconnected. The United States and its allies are experiencing new forms of conflict below the threshold of what is commonly understood as war. Would-be adversaries seek to avoid U.S. military strength, aiming instead to advance their objectives through other forms of coercion.
Whether it's the use of sanctions in other countries, economic statecraft, funding or arming proxies in another conflict.
It's impossible to ascertain where they came from precisely.
Security experts sometimes refer to this challenge set as gray zone conflict.
There's nuclear war, there's conventional war, tanks, ground forces, air forces fighting each other conventionally. And then there's what happens below that, which can range from information operations.
Massive cybersecurity breach at the Office of Personnel Management.
Unnamed U.S. government officials have said that China is suspected to be behind the attacks.
To targeted assassinations, to working by, with, and through proxy organizations.
This is the thing about the gray zone and a hybrid space. It never ends. It's constant. It's holistic. It's comprehensive. It uses all tools at its disposal. It can use religion. It can use culture. It can use the economy. Anything to help divide society, to continue to erode confidence and credibility in our democracy.
You have adversaries or competitors of the United States who are engaging in these activities, and they're different in scale, scope, the toolkit, but they have, I think, one common denominator: a desire to undermine U.S. or U.S. friends and allies' control of a region or a country or a maritime space through the use of tools short of direct force against the U.S. or its allies.
China has used non-transparent coercion against American companies that have done things that are considered to be problematic from China's point of view, or to send a diplomatic message.
Russia also shapes events on its borders and far beyond.
We were slow in identifying the Russian information operations in 2016.
Any country can employ this suite of tactics using political, informational, military, and economic tools to pressure, subvert, or co-opt a country.
It's not a strategy of brute force. It's a strategy of influence.
Democracy and open markets have become targets of this influence.
Gray zone strategy relies heavily on creating a narrative contrary to U.S. interests, and of demonstrating the ineffectiveness of American peacetime tools.
It's to go to our strength, which is our democracy and our alliance structure and everything we stand for, and to destroy that.
We acknowledge the threat. It is real. It is continuing. It goes beyond the elections. It goes to Russia's intent to undermine our democratic values, drive a wedge between our allies, and do a number of other nefarious things.
Even though the government has improved its ability to monitor these actions, it has not yet developed ways to respond to them.
Technology always moves faster than regulation. Products and services that enable social media don't fit neatly into the consumer safety or regulatory constructs of the past.
We have military doctrines designed to deal with war. We have diplomatic doctrines designed to deal with the normal to and fro of statecraft and diplomacy. We have not developed the kinds of doctrines and even beyond that, institutional, organizational, or strategic muscle memory to be able to deal with the kinds of activities that come above the line of normal diplomacy and statecraft and below the line of war.
We'll explore three of today's most commonly used gray zone tactics: information warfare, economic coercion, and ambiguous forces. Then we'll examine options for responding to these challenges.
Video back up. Great. Okay. Admiral Rogers. Admiral Rogers, as I think everyone knows, is the second commander, of U.S. Cyber Command, concurrently also the 17th director of the National Security Agency. Previously, you had lengthy experience in countering cyber warfare and overseeing all Navy cyber warfare efforts as commander of the 10th Fleet, commander of U.S. Cyber Command. You have been on the information side, at least in the gray zone, for long before the term became popular. Can you give a sense of now out of the NSA and out of Cybercom for some months, a little bit of perspective on everything that you've seen as it has evolved? How would you characterize what we're seeing happening, at least in the information sphere?
So let me just frame a little broadly for me personally. Yeah. So retired about almost 6 months now. And as I was leaving government, I had two macro concerns that really were at the forefront for me from national security. The first was, what are the implications for our nation's security for these massive technology changes that we're seeing today and that are in the near term? I define near term as, say, in the next 2 to 5 years. I was concerned about that. AI, 5G, quantum computing, things that you can see that are coming, I think, are real game changers. The second thing, and really the focus of today that concerned me, was I saw the nature of competition changing in a way that I thought to myself, the world around us is changing, and I'm not sure from a government perspective in terms of recognition, reaction, policy development. I thought I don't think yet we've really crystallized on what are the implications of this changing world. And this really goes to this idea of the gray zone, where I think most nations around the world have come to the conclusion, look, you do not want to go head to head in an armed conflict against the United States. That is not going to turn out in your favor, and it's not really optimal to achieve whatever your objective is. Therefore, if you're trying to achieve advantage or an end state that reflects your national interests, which is what nation states do, what are the tools and tactics that are available to you that don't trigger this U.S. superiority, if you will? Because it's still one area where I would argue, again, it varies by specifics, but broadly, we have militarily strong advantage in the world. That continues to change over time. Don't question that for 1 minute. But it has driven, I think, many of the nation states around the world in particular. I also questioned myself, so what happens to the non-state actors that are watching this over time? What kind of tactics, what kind of changes do they make? As I watched nation states evolve, you saw this play out in the cyber domain, in the informational domain, in the economic domain, and then this idea of false narrative is part of the information piece, but as you guys mentioned in the video, the ambiguous piece of this. How do I get the U.S. to slow its policy mechanisms because of the ambiguous nature of what I'm doing? Because generally for us on the U.S. side, almost all of our policy starts from a premise. We understand what has happened, we understand who did it, and we understand why they did it. And when there is this ambiguous piece, whether it's in cyber, whether it's in some of the actions that we saw in the Ukraine and elsewhere, it really tends to slow the process down, which I think most of our competitors out there have come to understand about us. That's a way to negate some of the capabilities that we enjoy, advantages that we enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on. One of the things those of us who sort of have been a party to national security over the years, we're used to thinking about how to plan against events where we have decision point. There's a clear decision point, essentially. It's somebody invades something, or there is an act of aggression undertaken that we can define. And here we have a whole set of actions and actors who seem to be thwarting the whole clean way, if you will, that we have developed our statutes, we've organized our processes. I think that's sort of the point Jake Sullivan's raising in the video we just showed is very much along the lines of what you just said. Do you think that you mentioned the non-state, what you worry about the non-state learning from the state, but I'm also wondering how much the states, even though they have different interests and different goals, might be learning from each other. You have reason to believe that they're watching what each other are doing?
So you watch state actors, I'll focus on cyber and then broaden out a little bit. You look at state actors in the cyber arena, and we are watching state actors create relationships with non-state actors to achieve state objectives, oftentimes lending tools and capabilities from the nation state to the non-state actor, helping the non-state actor, this is what interests me. If you will do this and you will share the data with me, hey, there's other things you're doing, I'm gonna leave you alone. So you're watching nation states create relationships with non-state actors as a way to use capability to blur attribution, and again, attempt to emphasize this ambiguous, hey, did they really think it's us? Some, I can remember a couple discussions at times with our Russian counterparts who would sit there and say to you, look, we don't control all the activity of criminal actors within our nation state. Do you do that? You can't tell us that you can guarantee that it wasn't a criminal entity doing this. How can you say it was us? You have similar actors who are not aligned with your nation in the United States. You have criminal activity. You're telling me you have knowledge and control of all of that? I look at the Russians and the Chinese in particular, but I'd also emphasize, don't view this as just a Russia and a China challenge. I would argue you've seen the North Koreans, you've seen the Iranians use some of these same kinds of tactics. This is having some measure of success. Given that, I expect you to see more of this and not less of this. I think nation states have come to the conclusion this is the way to sustain advantage in a world in which you believe the U.S. has some significant, strong advantages and capabilities. So how do you negate that? And among our greatest capabilities, not just the military piece. So how do you attack their strengths in terms of you go after their institutions, you go after their values, and you cause them to question internally in a way that, quite frankly, we're just not used to as a nation. And yet that's the world we find ourselves in now. And I think we got to ask ourselves as a nation, so what does it mean? How are we going to deal with it? Because just trying to sit here and say, well, it's just an interesting phenomenon, guys, that isn't going to get us where we need to be. We saw evolution in behavior of nation states after the Second World War. You're seeing more evolution continue. We were able to deal with that very well. My opinion is, look, we can deal with this, but we've got to acknowledge this is different. And the other challenge, I think, for us is how do you do this within a Western democracy? Because the information piece is so critical here, and yet our society prides itself. It's one of the building blocks for us. Information is not regulated by the government. Everyone should have the right to speak their minds. Information shouldn't be regulated, and information should be able to flow through multiple means to the broadest audience possible. Those have been strengths for us as a nation. And yet now you're watching actors out there try to turn that to their advantage and our disadvantage. And we've got to ask ourselves, so what does that mean, and how do we deal with it? And that doesn't matter if you're in the government, if you're running a platform out there like a Facebook or others, if you're working in private business and your data model is all about the acquisition of data, for example. My argument would be this is so much broader than just the government, please.
Right. I want to get to pretty much everything you just talked about. No, that's good. That was a very good overview. So let's kind of break down some pieces of that. Let's start with the inside U.S. federal government piece. You had just earlier this fall, obviously you had the emphasis in February of the National Defense Strategy, National Security Strategy on these areas of competition, as you mentioned, particularly with regard to Russia and China. In February of 2018, while you were still in office, you were testifying and you said, we're probably not doing enough. They, in this case, the they was Russia, haven't paid a price, at least that's sufficient to get them to change their behavior. Since then, we've had the announcement of NSPD, I think it's 13, yes, just last month in October. And Cybercom has been, via that NSPD 13, has been given the go-ahead for offensive cyber operations. So talk a little bit about that specific measure, and then more broadly, what is it that we can and should be doing better to deter actors from this kind of behavior?
So broadly, I think we're going in the right direction in cyber. I'll only speak for myself. My argument when I was part of the team was we want to keep the full range of options and capabilities available. And we want our potential adversaries and our competitors to understand we will consider the full range of options. We will decide on a case-by-case basis what we're going to do, but we are prepared to consider all of it. And one of the things that frustrated me at times was, why are we taking one element just straight off the table?
That being the offensive.
That being cyber. Where my argument was, look at the world around us. Many of our competitors view cyber as actually a lower risk option for them. Why do you think they're doing this? Their view is they can engage in these behaviors, not strip any kind of strategic threshold with the United States, and pay a very low, if any, price for what they're doing. They view this as a less risk-based approach to what they're doing. On the other hand, we went to the other spectrum. Wow, this is really high risk. Let's not really go there. And my attitude for me was, I think we need a little more nuance here. I'm not saying that the answer always is respond with cyber. I have never argued for that, privately or publicly. What I always said is, you need to consider cyber as a tool. It's just one of many options that are available. We should consider that, though. And I think we see advantage to competitors and adversaries when we start from a premise that says, ooh, we're not even going to consider this. I just thought, boy, if you're in Moscow or Beijing, you are loving this approach to life, because it doesn't really change your risk calculus. And I thought in the end, what we needed to achieve on the US side was we have got to get these nation states and adversaries to reassess their risk calculus. Because right now their calculus, again, speaking back, when I left, was risk is very reasonable. We engage in some pretty aggressive aspects of both cyber and the information dynamic. It's difficult for them to prove and tie it to us. It tends to accentuate fissures that already exist within their society. It tends to take advantage of the Western democratic institutions that have stood us in such great stead. But for those authoritarian states out there, they look at us and go, I'm going to turn that to advantage for me. And I think we're going in the right direction. Don't get me wrong, I'm very happy with what I see. And now, like you, I'm on the outside looking. I'm very happy with the broad direction we're going. I still think one of the big pieces missing in this is how do we bring the government and the private sector together on this? This can't be, well, it's just about a government policy. We'll put out a new national security presidential directive, problem solved. This is not going to be enough. How do we address that government and that private world? Because information, infrastructure, it doesn't recognize these arbitrary divides that we have as a society. It's just the nature of technology and the nature of the business models that we have created. And I'm not arguing that those are bad business models. My only comment is those business models were built using a very industrial age approach to things. What's the role of the government? What's the role of the private sector? I'm not sure that they're really optimized for this digital world that we live in which information and the very freedoms that are a cornerstone to us are actually being turned against us.
Well, on the private sector piece, let's start first on the tech companies and social media companies who seem to have evolved their thinking, maybe is a polite way to put it. Most recently seen with their testimony on the Hill this fall, in which they seemed much more open to the idea of legislative corrections. What do you think would be most meaningful with that sector as an incentive structure that the federal government, namely through legislation, but maybe not only through legislation, could provide to shape the way we operate in this space with Western values?
So first thing, and I've said this with many of them out in Silicon Valley, is if I were in your shoes, I would not want to have something jammed down my throat by the government. I would think if I was in your shoes, what I'd want to do is partner with the government to see if I can develop something that both ensures my business competitiveness, because I acknowledge for them, hey, without that competitiveness, they can't live, they can't exist. How do I ensure I continue that competitiveness? At the same time, I realize that I'm executing this function, this informational dynamic in an environment in which people are assuming identity and hosting or generating content that is absolutely false. There were two prisms to this. Identity and accuracy, I always thought. Can I be sure that who has this entity that I think is this, is that really them or is that somebody else? And then secondly, how accurate is the information that I'm getting from them? So I think if we could get together between the private sector and the government to work on some kind of foundational principles, and then how can we coordinate with each other, not control, I'm not arguing that the answer here is the government needs control, but I always thought the answer was, hey, how do we coordinate with each other in a way that historically, again, because we have this government definition and this private sector, we're all in our lanes, I'm not sure that that's going to work.
But in your conversations in Silicon Valley, do you have reason for optimism that they are open to that kind of partnership?
So I see recognition of the problem. Hey, we acknowledge that there is a measure of responsibility here as a platform host that perhaps we didn't anticipate or consider when we started this journey. And they're on a journey just like the rest of us. So I do see recognition, and I think that's a real positive. The part that I'm still trying to argue we need to be a little more aggressive on is recognition is the first step in the problem, in solving the problem, but what we want to do is solve the problem.
Yeah.
So we need to move beyond, yep, that's important, I think we need to do it too. Could we come up with some very specific steps and recommendations and responsibilities, who is going to do what in all this? And we're still not I don't think my sense is we're not where we need to be or where we want to be.
And the technology itself, you mentioned this earlier, worrying about quantum, worrying about AI. I mean, looking not very far ahead today and then ahead to things like spoofing capabilities. It's scary for many people to see where the technology is going in terms of the ability to defend. Are you comfortable that we have the technology edge on the defensive side? And if you're not comfortable, what would be the most meaningful things we could do to get better?
So I'd answer that two ways. The first is, I don't want to reject the premise, but
That's
my first
fine.
comment is think beyond technology. This is about so much more than just technology. This is about culture and ethos. I mean, I have this discussion with my own children about, okay, so how do you attempt to ensure access to a broad spectrum of opinions so as you are trying to work your way through life and figure out what you believe and what you agree with and what you don't agree with? So I would argue there's some pretty foundational things for all of us as individuals, like I would stop relying on one source for my news. I don't care what that particular source is for you. I would argue we've got to broaden ourselves. I look at us as a society right now and I am struck by we are all living in mini echo chambers. We self-reinforce constantly. The way we assimilate data, the news that we pay attention to, we just keep listening to a viewpoint that reinforces our perceptions. And my view is, I don't think that's optimal for us. That's also not helped by this idea of others using information as a dynamic to attempt to change, splinter, tear apart. I'm like, look, so I just think as consumers, we've got to learn to be a little bit broader.
I agree with you, and I do want to follow up on the sort of the public policy piece relating to media literacy, et cetera. But just to push a little harder on the tech piece, if you think of it just in the security sphere now, if we're thinking just about putting back on your Navy hat, the problems we could encounter in the battle space because of the advances in, for example, spoofing, for example, that inability to tell who it is that's sending something and the accuracy of what they're sending. Do you feel that we are on a good trajectory to manage that part of the battle space?
So generally, from a technical standpoint, I would argue the offensive side still has the advantage. Having said that, I never felt that the ability to ensure the defensive piece was beyond reach. I just thought to myself, hey, it's harder, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I didn't think that I couldn't do it. I just always thought to myself, this is going to be harder. It goes to things like, I used to remind people, look, if your strategy is predicated, I'm going to spend all my resources just making sure nobody gets in, don't think that's going to work. You need to build a strategy where I'm both trying to stop you from getting in, but I am going to acknowledge that despite my best efforts, there's a potential that you're going to get in, and therefore part of my strategy is going to be, how do I drive you out? Because I'd be the first to admit, as a person who has both defended and penetrated networks for his living, it is very different. A strategy to keep someone out versus a strategy to drive someone out who's already in is totally different, and I have done both multiple times. So I never felt that the defensive piece was out of reach. Again, I thought the hardest part wasn't the technology. In terms of defense, I thought in many ways that the biggest challenge was, how do I address culture and ethos? Because you can have the greatest defensive structure in the world, but if you have operators who make poor choices, your defensive capabilities are often negated or minimalized, which is less than optimal. And so I just always urge people, as important as the technology is, and I spent the last few years in particular running two very technically focused organizations and spent a lot of time out in the private sector talking about technology aspects. Just there's more to this than just the tech piece.
And that comes back, I think, to the point you were making before about the public-private, perhaps unique, but certainly for the U.S. is among the most exposed in terms of its public-private intersection because of the way we constitute ourselves as a free society. So we think about things like critical infrastructure and the role of key industries, whether it's defense industrial base or the energy sector, et cetera. Do you feel, moving again beyond the media, the social media companies and the tech companies in Silicon Valley, do you feel that the banking sector, the energy sector, the defense industrial sector are beginning to change their culture, or perhaps have gone further than beginning, have evolved significantly in light of the challenge that they may face, that we may all face?
So first, I think we need to rethink the way we define critical infrastructure. And I was part of that process for 2 administrations, and I could kick myself as I look back. Rogers, you didn't think broadly enough. I thought we approached this initially, 4 or 5 years ago when we did the first 16, that we approached it from a very industrial age perspective. So what is it that generates some output, some outcome that we care about as a nation, largely output? So we were thinking finance, we were thinking energy, we were thinking transportation. I don't think we thought enough about output, not just in terms of a product or a service, but the election piece to me was really, right. In hindsight, I could kick myself. I never thought of the idea of, so is ensuring a democratic outcome that generates confidence from its citizens,
right.
Is that a critical? In hindsight, I'd say, boy, hell yeah, we should have thought of this. The last thing is my thinking is continue to evolve in this. We're not thinking enough about data when it comes to critical infrastructure. Data concentrations increasingly, to me, are critical infrastructure. Because in the digital world of the 21st century, data is the gold. That's why you see nation states developing artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum. This is all about there's this massive amount of data out there, and we can optimize it in ways that were impossible 5-10 years ago to generate outcomes. Those outcomes can be positives, those outcomes can be negatives. Right. So I think we need to think more about data. If I look at the 17 segments that are currently recognized, the electoral being the 17th, the one that was added with the current administration, and again, I was part of that, it's uneven. Those sectors that have either come to acknowledge that cyber represents a challenge to the very business model, I would argue the financial side was very good about that early on, because at its heart, the global financial structure is based on the premise of trust. That I can have trust that at any second I can stop the problem and I know exactly who has how much money, where the transactions are, with confidence. That's what enables us to do these millions of transactions electronically, simultaneously on a global basis, and move money in ways that, again, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, we never even imagined. You think of the speed, you think of the agility, you think of the growth that has enabled. That's all predicated in many ways on this simple idea of trust. I can believe the data, I can believe the flows. What happens if that goes away? And cyber threatens that in some ways. Not the only thing that does, but cyber threatens that in some ways, in some scenarios. And so I thought that sector early on recognized, this really fundamentally could call our business model into question. We have got to focus on this. They are also advantaged by the fact, if we're honest, they have a lot of money. There's very few companies in the world that can spend $500 million every year on a baseline cybersecurity budget. You find that among the largest banks in the world. Right. You don't find that in most other segments. They just don't have the money. You look at some segments, power, one of the conversations I used to have with the power segment is we were talking about at Cyber Command, we had a mission directed by the President or the Secretary to defend critical infrastructure from cyber attack. As I would talk to the power structure, they would often say to me, Mike, you don't understand our business model. We're a regulated sector. The only way we generate revenue is through rates. Rates are controlled by a regulatory commission. I just can't change my rates and generate more money to pay for some of these defensive things that you and others are saying that we need to do. So it's uneven. Finance I'd give high. The other one that really concerns me, healthcare. The reason I say that is it is kind of the embodiment of several trends you see. Number one, Internet of Things. The number of remotely connected medical devices that we are creating, great for us in terms of health, longevity, economic growth and development. But I look at those and I go, wow, we are not putting cybersecurity in as a fundamental design aspect to many of these things. We are doing, you get home and you get a daily readout on what your pacemaker is doing. that means it's got remote access, remote connectivity. Those are potential points of vulnerability. I'm not arguing that remote access is a bad thing. I'm saying we need to account for a measure of cybersecurity in it that just hasn't been the historic norm. So Internet of Things, and put on top of that one of the biggest concentrations of personally identifiable information on any of us in any sector. Look, we as a society long ago came to the conclusion, I want to go to my doctor's office once, I want to fill out the paper, give that doctor all the data they need, but I don't want to repeat this process when I go see the radiologist. I don't want to go repeat this process when I go see an orthopedic individual. So we have injected this massive amount
even prescriptions, right? All
of
our
information,
yeah.
and then we have pushed it out across this plethora of medical providers. Again, for ease, convenience, speed, those are all good attributes. But the flip side is, so now this data is just spread in significant places that are not necessarily optimized from a security standpoint. And at times I wonder, do we really know how much data is out there on us and who has it?
Let's talk a little bit more deeply on the issue of election security, and I maybe broaden that a little bit out, not to avoid that, because I do want you to talk about that, but broaden it out just a little bit to sort of civil society and U.S. constitutional pillars, which could include the judiciary, it's the election process, it's our faith in government. We've just had a major election. There seem to be, at least at this point, publicly reported fewer signs of foreign interference. What do you make of that? Is that what you think happened? And how should we think about both what progress we have or haven't made in election security and where if we're going to skate to where the puck is going, and if challengers are indeed still coming after the foundations of our society, where should we be thinking about where they're going?
So number one, I think you have to acknowledge we made progress, which is a good thing. Both we have recognized the issue, we've put resources against it, we've changed structures and processes trying to help us achieve a better result and ensure that we have confidence in the result that comes out of the process. So that's all good. The issues where I'd say we still have further to go. The election process is another interesting example to me of the historic model that we've created versus the challenges of the digital age. What do I mean? In our structure, our legal framework mandates elections are a local and a state-driven initiative. They often translate into national results, but they're done under the control and the direction of a state or local or municipal entity. The challenge to me, I always thought, was, so you tell me how you expect individual counties, small cities, to withstand the targeted efforts of entire nation states that in some scenarios are focused on them. And if you go back to the 16 timeframe, although it's gotten better, you had some entities out there arguing, whoa, wait a second, what are you, the federal government, doing coming to us? This is a state or a local process. You're not involved in this. You need to stay out of this. And I'm going, again, this is an example to me of, do we need to step back and ask ourselves, so how can we retain that legal framework? How can we generate confidence? But is one of the ways to also generate confidence, do we need to step back and look, what are some structures we can put in place to generate more confidence, greater security capability? I just think that's another example
and the
of
example
this
you already
new
gave
world that we're in.
of the creating a critical infrastructure around at the federal level around elections is a step in that direction, I assume.
But I think we just need to take it a little further.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean that I'm arguing that the answer is the federal government ought to control it. You will never hear me say that. I'm trying to figure out, so how can we take capacity and capability at the federal level and ensure it is applied state and locally as part of a team to help them in the execution of their responsibilities. That's my only point. So that's getting better. And then the other thing is, as a guy who used to attack targets for a living, so to speak, I always urge people, look, you've got to look at this election process as an ecosystem, and you got to map it.
Right.
It's more than just when I walk into a booth and I pull a lever or I hit a switch. It's voter registration, it's the data flow, where does it reside? If it can be manipulated or changed in any part of that process, that's something we need to be concerned about. So just don't fixate on all that matters is when I go to my polling place. There's a whole lot more to this process, and we just need to step back, map that process, and make sure that we're confident that we have the steps in place, the controls, and the safety measures and security measures in place to generate confidence. Because in the end, that's what we're trying to do. We're not, from a government perspective, you're not trying to shape outcome. You're trying to ensure that the citizens of our nation have confidence in the outcome, because it's their outcome. It's not a government's outcome. And that has always been one of our great strengths, and boy, I sure don't want to lose that. So we're going in the right direction. I still think there's some things that we need to do, because they're not, whether it was the Russians we saw in 2016, don't think that 2016 was a one-time aberration. This is going to continue. As long as nation states believe they can generate advantage, this will continue. And this had been a trend that we had watched for a long time. The difference in 2016 in many ways was increased use of technology, the extent of the data that they were able to access, and the fact that, boy, historically, we had watched them steal data before, but often manipulate it and then put it out. One of the things that struck me as really interesting, you didn't see much manipulation this time. You saw extraction of data at levels we hadn't seen before, and then you saw it pushed out directly without any changes. That's an interesting shift in tactics on their part. Again, I believe they did that because their view is,
we don't need to touch this.
I don't need to touch this.
It's not to our advantage this time.
The reality is their attitude is, look, the reality doesn't match the Americans' narrative. They keep talking about these institutions. They talk about the purity of their process. They talk about the values. Look at the way the inside talks to each other. Those don't seem to represent those values. Aha. So they didn't, I think in their view, they decided they didn't even need to manipulate it this time.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll go to the audience. I want to pull even one further layer to something you mentioned before, sort of about each individual American, in this case America, the responsibility, the role that we each play in terms of how we take in information, how we use information, how we build rather than tear down society. You've spent your entire career, still ongoing, in national service. How do you think we move forward as individual Americans to build back or build toward a sense of common purpose that makes it much harder for us to be taken advantage of?
I mean, the short answer is I don't know how, but boy, I sure think it's what we need to do. And again, I have this discussion with my own family. We as a nation, we've got to stop this fixation on it's the other guy's problem, it's the other guy's fault. I don't care what your position is. All I seem to hear these days is it's somebody else's problem, it's somebody else's fault. Hey, what are we going to do as individuals to make this better? Don't worry about the other guy. What are we going to do? Because that's how you solve problems. That's how you build coalitions. That's how you come together as teams. Because in the end, this is going to be about teamwork and how we come together as a society and a nation to deal with the challenges around us. And the reason we haven't been able to deal with many of these challenges, from my perspective, is because we haven't been able to coalesce as a team. We haven't been able to come together. We're spending way too much time blaming each other. It might make us feel good, but it doesn't generate outcomes. And in the end, we have got to generate outcomes for our nation, for the broader world that we're a part of, for our friends and allies. And we're only going to do that if we start to ask ourselves, hey, what can each of us do? There is no easy answer in this. I wish there was, but I don't think there is.
All right, I want to go to the audience. We have microphones coming around, so if you raise your hand and I call on you, it's one question, please. It is a question, and I'll look for a hand. I've got one right over here. I'm not sure where the mic is. Yep. And please, I'm sorry, I should have said, stand up and state your name and affiliation if you have one.
Michael Martell from the National Security Archive. I had a question about personal use consumer culture of internet technology. Is there anything that can and should be done to encourage the consumer culture to prioritize security of devices they're purchasing relative to affordability and convenience?
Right. So there's a very complex, very interesting question, very complex one. Just a couple of just quick thoughts. Number one, I'm trying to figure out in my own mind, so how do we incentivize behavior? Because in general, when you incentivize behavior, our social norms over time, they drive you towards the outcomes that you want. Now, for example, you take a look at automotive safety. We decided to incentivize automotive behavior, automotive safety through a combination of government regulation, insurance, and we incentivize for consumers, for example, with, you buy a car with airbags and air brakes, we're going to give you a better insurance rate. That incentivized consumer choice. It also incentivized producers' behavior. Hey, look, if more people can buy this vehicle, if it has the following safety features, perhaps it's in my best interest to produce vehicles that have those kinds of safety features. And then overlaid government regulations. So I'm trying to figure out, is there kind of an equivalent kind of thing that we can do that incentivizes the behavior that we all display? For example, we just take automotive safety is just a given now. It's so ingrained in us, and yet I can remember as a teenage driver a long time ago, compared to many of you in the room, it wasn't that way at all. When I got my license in the mid-'70s, that wasn't, I don't remember the attitude being the same thing at all. I can remember as a kid driving in cars without seatbelts. Hey, that's just the way it was on our family vacations. You would never think about doing that now. So how do we incentivize behavior? The other thing I'm trying to figure out, if you take an example like Underwriter Laboratories, where we created minimal safety standards across industries, developed an independent entity to both develop and test those products to ensure they're being met, I'm wondering, is there a similar kind of model? Is there some kind of framework that we could create where we could get broad industry agreement on baseline standards and then a testing and oversight mechanism to ensure compliance with them? Again, I can remember that from my youth and how significant Underwriter Lab, approval on something was, and I'm not trying to pick on Underwriter Labs. It's just an example to me of, are there mechanisms that we can create that incentivize change, if you will? So those are just two things I think that could affect, consumer behavior, which I think is at the heart of your question, really.
Right here. Thank you.
Eunjung Cho with the Voice of America. What is your assessment of cyber threat posed by North Korea? And North Korea is increasingly moving towards more money-making tactics in the cyber domain. So how is the Cyber Command and U.S. government, in a more broader sense, guarding against such threat from North Korea? Thank you.
So there's like 3 different questions in there. Let me take the first 2 because I don't want to speak for Cyber Command of the government because I'm a retired individual now. North Korea always was interesting to me. You watch the way the arguably, at least the only publicly acknowledged nation state to engage in offensive actions in cyber against the United States in the form of Sony in November of 2014. So the only nation state publicly acknowledged to have ever done that. Secondly, you watch the level of their investment increase. You also watch the North Koreans view cyber as a tool to attempt to overcome or negate the sanctions. So for example, it's the only government that I can remember seeing where cyber was used at a nation state level to generate revenue in the form of stealing cryptocurrencies, bitcoins, and secondly, going after the global banking system to steal money. I've never seen another nation state do that, but you watch the North Koreans do that, in part because always assessed, hey, the sanctions are having an impact. They're trying to get around that. They can't move money. It's harder for them to move things. It's harder for them to bring goods in and out. It's harder for them to generate revenue. Is cyber a tool for them to attempt to overcome that in some ways? And so you watch them start to view cyber as a tool to do just that. So those are really the 2 biggest changes I've seen from them. Their risk calculus also very different. That should be of concern to us. At times they're willing to do things that most nation states just would go, ooh, boy, that's pretty risky. Perhaps this is going to trigger a response. Their risk calculus seems to be very different.
Okay, question right here.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Would you say that the U.S. has a national interest in the massive amount of data that's collected on, for example, U.S. citizens, in the same way that the Chinese government seems to think that they have a sort of proprietary interest in this massive amount of data, which is accumulating over there with their private companies and public also on the Chinese population?
So I wanna go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just want to make sure I understand. Is the premise of the question, is it a
Well, the
US
issue of like
right to-
data localization is an example, is a subset of this question. You know, for instance, a country says, well, we want the information on our citizens kept in our country. And the thought is ultimately, if you have enough massive data on a population and the knowledge of it, then that gives you, with the type of analysis you're talking about that's possible now, an optimization, the ability to manipulate that population with messages. Well, you'll know what the effect will be. So that might be the proprietary interest of a country not to let another country have that information so that they could then launch attacks.
Clearly control of data, access to data, control of data, awareness of data, where data resides are going to be key questions as we work our way through this. As a democratic society, we start from a fundamentally different premise than authoritarian states do. I think that's a good thing. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. I like our structure. I would argue it's in the best interest. At the same time, we also acknowledge, look, as we're trying to generate insights as to what nation states and actors are doing out there that would be of concern to our nation, that we need to acquire data and insight that helps us understand, identify, and characterize the behaviors we're seeing, helps us understand not just what they're doing, but why they're doing it. And that was, the core part of our job at the National Security Agency, largest intelligence organization in the U.S. government, was attempting to understand that. And at the same time realizing we're attempting to generate those understandings as part of a Western democracy in which the rights of the individual are the cornerstone of our nation. It's one of the fundamental premises of our entire structure. And so there's always a bit of this tension. My attitude always was, I'm never going to violate what I believe in are the values of our society in the name of our security. I fundamentally reject that premise. Now, it's easy to say, sitting on a stage here, having been in some tense situations at times, it's not always so easy in the aftermath of significant trauma, where you just have these very human emotions of, I see this visual image of, and 9/11 is the one that I still remember. I'd be the first to acknowledge, I still cannot watch the towers falling without visibly getting just pissed off. Every time I see that image, nobody's going to do that to us. Nobody. That goes against everything we believe. Those buildings were representative of the freedom of our nation to me. It wasn't just Americans in those buildings, it was a lot of non-US persons. That's our society. And people were coming and going that day, whether you were in business in the building or you were a first responder, and you look at how that event affected so many people, changed it certainly changed, like many of you, the professional life I had after 9/11 was very different than the professional life before. It fundamentally changed our society in some ways, certainly changed our national security prioritization, the way we looked at the world around us. I would never argue that in the name of our security, we become something we aren't and we lose sight of our values. And so we just always have to be mindful of that as we're working through this data piece. But we've also got to acknowledge those are legitimate questions that we ought to step back and really delve into. And it doesn't make somebody bad because they're asking those kinds of questions.
All right, let's see, I want to make sure I get everybody over here. We'll come to Mitzi, and then we'll come here to Harlan, and that'll probably be it. So why don't I put you two together, and if you don't mind answering two at once.
Got it. Hello, Mitzi.
Where's the mic? Thank you. I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School, and Mike and I have known each other a long time. He was a part of my MIT seminar years ago.
And she passed me, so.
Oh, very good.
I worry about having enough instructors in the whole IT world, and since people who know how to do that get paid a lot of money, and we can't get them into our high schools, into our universities, how are we going to create the cadre of talent to deal with all of this?
Great, okay, hold that thought, and then we'll add this second question.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. In grappling with the real issues here, I wonder if one of the critical issues that we really haven't addressed is that for the bulk of the Cold War, we were organized on the basis of really having a principal threat, and we did pretty well. To paraphrase Donald Trump, we killed people too, and we were quite successful. And obviously, the digital age and diffusion of power makes a difference. But my question is, we were pretty good when it was one-on-one with a principal adversary. But now that adversaries could be the 800-pound kid on a couch, as the president likes to say, or other people, we're not so good at dealing with competition. And I wonder what suggestions you might have in terms of organization, but more than that, a strategic concept for dealing with a world that is much diffuse and a organization of government that really is directed to dealing basically with one big threat at a time.
Okay, so workforce.
Two big questions. Workforce.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, I don't see us ever being able to create enough workforce. I just think that the shortages we have now are not a short-term phenomenon. I see this extending into the future. I don't know how far, but as I look at that 2 to 5 year window, I go, I don't think we're going to people our way out of this. So I think it argues, how do you optimize technology so that we can apply the human capital where it really matters the most? In the 2 organizations I ran, I spent a lot of time asking myself, is the workforce really optimized for the outcomes that we have to generate? And do I have people doing functions that, quite frankly, I should have a machine doing? For analysis, for example, I would go, look, if what you're doing is basic pattern recognition, guys, we can train a machine to do that. That is not the best use of human capital. So, Mitzi, to your question, I don't think we're going to work our way out of this from a people standpoint. The technology piece is going to be important here. I do acknowledge we're going to need to look at the educational dynamic of this a little differently than we have. I'm trying to figure out in this case, and I don't have an answer yet on my own mind, where is training appropriate versus where is education appropriate? Because the 2 aren't synonymous. And at times, in my experience, we often tend to use these interchangeably. Hey, it's get everybody an education. And I'm going, I don't think we got a model where we're getting everybody to a 4-year undergraduate degree or a graduate or a doctorate level. That kind of approach, that should be a component of a strategy, but I'm not sure that's the end-all be-all in this. Because I would look at some of our best people and I would go, no formal education, but man, am I glad you're working for us. You were just so good at this. So that'd be the one piece. On the structural side, I think your fundamental premise is an accurate one. Look, we structured in the post-World War II era largely around the idea, if you can deal with the Soviets, everything else is a lesser case. And we had one single, I would argue, national security premise, containment, containment, containment. Everything was largely focused for 45 years around one strategy against one opponent, and everything else really proved to be a lesser case in some ways. I wonder if the lesser case premise still works, maybe, but I worry that there's no one single strategy here that, like containment. I've always thought to myself, is there kind of an equivalent, a single strategy, phrase, word that could really encapsulate what's the broad set of pieces that we need to enact moving forward? I'm not sure that there's an equivalent. I'd love to figure this out in my own mind, but I'm still not there yet. I do also agree we need to step back and take a look at structure and processes. You look at things like CSIS, which is how we look at, how foreign nations acquire critical business components in the United States. I think CSIS needs to be fundamentally restructured. You look at cybersecurity. I thought, boy, we got a lot of capacity in the federal government, but it is awful spread out. It's very disparate. It's not particularly integrated, and it's not fast. Hey, what kind of structure could we put in place that would bring those values and those attributes? So I don't have a single solution other than to acknowledge, I think that there's some fundamental structural changes that we need to make. It's one of those, when I said the 2 issues, when I started by saying the 2 issues as I was leaving that really concerned me were, the first one was technology and its implications for national security. One of the implications of that was, I'm not sure structurally we're optimized to deal, not forget about the technical piece, I'm not sure structurally we're really optimized to deal with this. So I do acknowledge there's some things that we need to do differently in terms of structure.
Admiral Mike Rogers, thank you very much for this incredibly valuable opening to our session. Thank you for your many years of service you've already had. I know you'll have more in other ways going forward. Life keeps going.
I'm still working.
So please, before you join me in a round of applause for Admiral Rogers, just so you know, when you finish that applause, we're going to switch over to John Schaus, who's a fellow in our International Security Program, and he'll be doing a presentation for you to tee up the rest of the event. But without further ado, please join me in thanking Admiral Rogers.
Thanks, Kath.
That's great.
All right. Big time.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this year's Global Security Forum. As Kath mentioned, my name is John Schaus. I'm a fellow in the International Security Program, and I will give you a short briefing on the report that's in front of you. And then we have some audience participation planned for today based on the video you've seen and 2 additional videos that we will show over the next hour or so. Joe, could you go to the next slide, please? So this is an image of the report cover. Most of you have a copy in front of you. It's based on a experts working group we held in September of this year with about 95 participants drawn from across the political spectrum, old and young, Republicans and Democrats, regionalists, functionalists, and we really challenged them to not just think about how hard the gray zone problem is, but to think about what we can do to solve it. And so over the next few minutes, I want to walk you through quickly what the experts working groups came to. Next slide, Joe, please. Thank you. So we started the conversation about gray zones with a definition. You know, it's a good think tank, academic starting point. You must define the problem to answer the problem. But our working groups basically rejected the idea that we would have a clear, concise, specific definition. And instead, more or less out of these 3 working group conversations, they all came up with a common-ish set of attributes, which you can see in front of you. But really the key takeaways for me are gray zones are hard to define. There's a widespread agreement on a pattern of activity, but there's lots of debate about what specifically is in the core of that versus what's at the edges. And then the groups largely identified these 4 key areas. There's a bounded threshold, there's intentionality, there's ambiguity, which we heard about this morning, and the approaches are often multidimensional. They include private and public sector, they include different tools of national power. Joe, next slide, please. Thank you. In looking at these challenges, these gray zones, these actions that fall between normal peacetime diplomacy and the level of armed conflict, as we heard Jake Sullivan describe in the video, there were several key challenges. First, as we heard about this morning, are 4 primary actors. China and Russia stood out as the leading challenges, but Iran and North Korea were also included. Interestingly, all 3 groups came to largely these 4 actors, but no countries were offered as specific examples at the beginning of the discussions. They were independently generated by each group. And because of that, we assessed as kind of the conveners that there was a general consensus that China and Russia were the leading challengers for the United States and its interests. The groups also largely agreed that there are perceived U.S. weaknesses, such as our inability to respond quickly, largely because, as we heard about, our policies and our law are based on clear attribution and known actors and follow-on actions. And when that doesn't exist, it's hard for us in a legal and policy framework to move forward. That there are different types of challenges, state or private sector, the use of proxies, the goal of territorial expansion, which is happening in the South China Sea. We're seeing it ongoing in Crimea even this week. And that some of our greatest concerns are disinformation, political coercion, and economic coercion, all of which you heard about this morning in the keynote discussion. One common theme came out of this, though, which is that there was insufficient leveraging of the United States' vast array of strengths. And so, next slide, Joe. Want to spend a couple minutes talking through what each group identified as key strengths that the United States has. First and foremost, the breadth of our national security toolkit, to include hard power, soft power, economic power, diplomacy, information, technology. Across the board, the U.S. has great strengths. As the bottom item up there indicates, our challenge right now is figuring out how to best leverage those in a way that is consistent with our values. Other items include the size, diversity, resilience of our economy, alliances and partnerships, our military capability, and our soft power, our persuasive attributes as a country and as a government. Lastly, the next slide, please, Joe. We pulled together out of these very rich conversations what we heard are as 3 priorities for action. First, public public awareness and education. And this largely fell into three categories. Educating the general public on the kinds of threats we face, educating actors within the government, legislative and executive branch, both about the challenges facing us as a country and the tools that we have at our disposal that we could better leverage. And then finally, an area that applies across the board is media literacy. If you're listening to one source, your likelihood of bias is high, and the likelihood of bad information getting through is also high. So being able to identify, or at least better identify, accurate information, reliable sources, or potentially dubious sources was a key issue that the groups identified. Second, improving the US Toolkit. It is strong, but we can do more. We can streamline the use of tools. For example, sanctions are a frequently used tool, but it's rather difficult to implement them. And so there are things we could do from a procedural basis within the government to make it relatively faster to implement sanctions were they identified as an appropriate response. And then lastly, greater integration. And this covers a range of attributes. So first and foremost, integration within the United States government so that we don't live in these silos of State Department and Defense Department or Commerce and Treasury, but finding ways to integrate the conversation about the challenges and the possible responses. Second, which we heard about this morning, integrating across the public and private sectors, because many of the threats and challenges we face aren't directed necessarily at the government. It could be against healthcare information, it could be against corporate proprietary information, or it could be against national issues. And then lastly, which is also, I think, a key thing that was addressed by all groups, is integrating with allies and partners. One of the United States' greatest strengths is our network of alliances and partners, from NATO to our allies in Japan to a range of partners around the world, and finding a way to integrate our approaches with their approaches so that our collective responses are more effective. So with that, I want to turn to an interactive portion of our morning. You all have these little eye clickers, we call them, in front of you. Make sure you press the little button, the power button on them, so you get a green light. And what I'm going to do is ask you to think back to that first video and our subsequent keynote conversation. And I'm going to ask you a very complicated quiz. 2 questions. No right or wrong answers, but we want to get a sense of how people think about these challenges. Joe, next slide, please. So we've heard a lot about gray zone challenges, from economic coercion, political, election meddling, information warfare. Do you think these threats directly affect you? We have to wait until the screen lights up here in just a second, but Joe, if you hit the button, and we'll start voting. We think. There we go. So, the options: no, maybe, yes, or yes, and they already do. It gives us a vote tally, so I can see how many people are in the room. I know a lot of you haven't voted yet. Please do vote. I mean, there's a pretty preponderant answer, but only about half of you have responded so far. So it's in keeping with the American electoral tradition. Okay, we'll give it maybe 10 more seconds in case people are having technical difficulties. But this is interesting, right? Most of us see these as actual but potential threats, not threats that are already occurring and not imaginary. So I think that's a pretty interesting figure right there. All right, Joe, can we go to the second question, please? So assuming that you believe these are real threats, how much are you affected by it? Economic coercion as one case study. We had to reset it, so you might need to vote a second time. It's not like the actual election system. Your vote switches columns if you change your mind. You can't get double jeopardy voting. It's no problem. Interesting. Okay. So with that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Heather Conley, who will chair our next panel. Heather is the Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic here at CSIS, where she is also our Director of the Europe program. Heather will introduce the remainder of her panelists, but please join me in welcoming Heather and the panel.
Fantastic panel to help put a little, hopefully a little more black and white into that gray zone. I'm going to introduce everyone to my left, and then we will get started. Immediately to my left is my colleague Tom Wright, Director of the Center on U.S. and Europe at the Brookings Institute, also Senior Fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy. We need both. We need international order and we need strategy. Tom is also the recent author of the book, All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, and a prolific and insightful writer, and we're absolutely delighted that Tom could join us. Moving on to my left, Suzanne Spaulding, Senior Advisor here at CSIS. Prior to joining us, she was Undersecretary for National Protection and Programs at the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to that, she served in a variety of capacities, one of those General Counsel on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and is certainly one of those key experts on where the private sector and government intersect on critical infrastructure protection. Moving down, we have Derek Mitchell, Ambassador Derek Mitchell, who is the newly appointed president of the National Democratic Institute. Derek, congratulations. Prior to that, from 2012 to 2016, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Myanmar. He was formerly a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon, but we really were glad that he was a CSIS Senior Fellow a while back, so we still claim him as family. And last but not least, David Cohen, who's an adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security, but prior to that served as Deputy Director of the CIA from 2015 to 2017 and had a distinguished career at the Treasury Department, Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence with oversight over the FinCEN and OFAC, and Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing, served as a very distinguished career as a lawyer, focusing on a lot of criminal defense, white-collar crimes. We may have to talk about that in the illicit financing category, but all four of you, welcome. So I'm going to start out just being a little provocative because we talk about the gray zone as that space between war and peace. But when I talk to groups, particularly when I focus on Russian malign influence, I start my presentations by saying, my friends, this is war. We are at war and you don't know it. Am I right, or is it somewhere in between? David, I'm going to start with you and we'll work our way down. Is this war?
I think it is, if you consider war to be the effort of one nation to exert its will on another. And I think there's no question that what the Russians have been doing, and we can expand that to other countries, in using gray zone techniques has been an effort to both undermine American interests and advance their interests in ways that are, perhaps ultimately as effective as, what we regard as traditional war, kinetic activity.
Derek, are we at war?
We are in a type of war, absolutely. There's a conflict going on. I think, you have, as I think Mike Rogers talked about, countries looked at the United States after the Cold War and saw a country that was extremely powerful, that they can't go symmetrically against. So those who had different ideas about their interests and who felt that American power was not working to their interests were looking for asymmetrical ways to get at the United States. And looking at the country I focused on a lot when I was here at CSIS is China. And this is not new. I mean, we knew that China had discomfort with the alliances. We knew that they thought in terms of comprehensive national power. They talked in terms of wanting to achieve objectives short of war. I mean, that is part and parcel of Chinese strategy. It is almost a cliche. They try to achieve their objectives without leading to an actual kinetic war. So the idea of finding ways, finding key nodes, weaknesses in the United States, weaknesses in enemies, weaknesses in adversaries, goes back to classical Chinese strategy. So they look for those things that they can hit the United States, their alliances, their openness as a society, and over time, technology, those elements of comprehensive national power, and they use their entire country. They mobilize their entire country behind that. Yes, is it war? It's a type of war, I suppose, but it's also trying to achieve Chinese objectives and take the United States down in the process.
Suzanne, you were responsible for helping to protect the country from attempts to undercut it. Is this war? Did you view it as war when you were at the Department of Homeland Security?
So Heather, it's hard for me to escape the vestiges of my legal training. And so I am reluctant to attach a label that brings with it a lot of legal infrastructure. I think we often talk about war rhetorically, the war on drugs, the war on poverty. I remember in the early years following 9/11 trying to tell people that when folks in the administration were talking about a war on terrorism and a war on terror, they were not speaking rhetorically. That there were legal, there was a whole slew of legal arguments that was going to follow in the wake of that terminology that comes with war. So I'm not as ready. I think rhetorically, certainly, like you, when I talk to groups about what I see Russia doing in the information operations realm, targeting fundamental institutions of our democracy beyond elections, I talk about how we are under attack. And that is definitely the case. So if we are in a kind of war, my worry is that only one side is aware of it. Only one side is really at war. That we have not yet, despite this is an unusual group, you are self-selected, and I applaud you for your interest and for being here, to have 70% of the respondents say that yes, they are affected by this. I would venture to guess that if we did that poll across the American public, those results would be much lower. I think there is not a sufficient understanding of the threat to our fundamental national interests and our national security as a result of the activities that we'll talk about today and that they've talked about previously.
Tom, you may be the tiebreaker. War, peace, something in between. How do we think about this?
I guess I wouldn't see it as a war party, because I think we need to reserve that word for major war, general war. But I think what we're seeing is a competition or a clash, not just of major powers, but of different sort of social orders or different models of society, which I think it's increasingly clear are incompatible with each other. And on the one side, we have free societies, democratic countries, and on the other, we have neo-authoritarian countries. And I think what we don't normally appreciate, and what we haven't spoken about yet, is that our system is inherently threatening to neo-authoritarian regimes, right? So if you are in Beijing or Russia, if the liberal international order succeeds globally and indefinitely, that's very bad news for you, right? And that's not because necessarily of decisions that are taken by governments. In 2012, I think it's an interesting example, the New York Times and Bloomberg had a massive expose on the wealth, illicit wealth of the families of Chinese Politburo members. That was deeply destabilizing in Beijing. It was on the public record. It was just the nature of the free press. It destabilized their regime. That wasn't because of a decision that President Obama took. That was because of who we are, right? And we don't want to compromise on that because we don't want to repress well, maybe some people do, but most people don't want to repress the free press or basic freedoms. So they looked at our society and they saw that as a threat, and they wanted to respond to it by weakening us in some significant ways. And so I think they are trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism. We're trying to make it safe for democracy. And those two things are actually incompatible. And that, I think, is the root cause of our competition. And we have to wage that competition in a responsible way and push back very hard. But I see they don't necessarily believe that they are the aggressors here. They are insecure, which doesn't make us any more reassured, right? That's still very, very dangerous. But I think that's sort of the structural sort of root cause of where we find ourselves.
David and Derek, you want to jump in? David, I'll turn to you and then Derek.
Just very quickly, I think we'll talk this morning about a range of different gray zone activities and techniques and means to exert influence and undermine others. But to Suzanne's point about war having a legal definition, there are certainly some aspects of gray zone competition where the law of war actually does come into play, and in particular in cyber attacks. So destructive cyber attacks, if you think about them, depending on what you do and how you do it, can implicate law of war principles. So I actually tend to agree with this caution in describing this as war. When I was at Treasury overseeing our economic sanctions programs, I would always resist the label that it was economic warfare, because it wasn't war. It was coercive. We can talk about it. We were certainly trying to achieve our objectives using our economic leverage, but it's not war in the sense that you're harming people, engaging in violence. But there are aspects of this gray zone competition where you stay below the threshold that elicits a military response that is nonetheless implicates, I think, traditional concepts of warfare.
Derek, you wanted to jump in?
Well, just quickly, the war suggests, and that's why I call it gray zone, I suppose. It's not quite the war that we think of it as, and it's not quite peace. But war suggests that you're seeking to defeat an enemy entirely. And I think when it comes to, for instance, China, we have so much interdependence. We have to work together on so many things. It's not like a traditional war where they are trying to destroy us or it gets to, I think, what was said earlier about how China is trying to protect its own interests, trying to assert its own interests, assert its own view of its own power, of its own identity, both regionally and globally, and it sees the United States as somewhat in the way, maybe structurally. Just American interest in Asia is structurally a problem for China. And therefore, there is a conflict, there's a competition, but it's short of war, per se, which is true.
Well, and this is just pulling on some of the threads here. In some ways, Tom, you were suggesting there is ideology here. I often, when we talk about the gray zone, this is not ideological. This is not like the Soviet, the Great Clash in the Cold War. Well, there is an ideology behind it. This is democracy and open societies versus that neo-authoritarianism. So there is an ideological component to this. And well, Suzanne, I absolutely take the point. I think what I try to do, and this is exactly what I try to build awareness, because if you do not feel that it touches you personally, if we are not at war, how do you mobilize? How do you prepare everyone who has, it was absolutely to Admiral Rogers' point today, how do you mobilize yourself? Well, this isn't war. Well, it needs to feel like that because the war is in the palm of your hand. If you don't believe what your government is telling you and you take different actions, that is where their strength lies in doing that. But there is this ideology at foot here, and I would welcome, how do you use that within your former government positions out in think tanks? How do we help mobilize people to understand this is designed to be below threshold? It is designed for you not to really know, so you really won't act. How do you hit that? Suzanne?
So I think in the report that you all are putting out today, that CSIS is putting out today, has some very solid recommendations on that. And of course, the first one, as you heard, is raising public awareness. And that's what so many of us spend so much time trying to do. So I do think it is, unfortunately, it would be helpful to have senior leadership talking to people about how our adversaries are using information operations, sometimes enabled by cyber, to weaken us. And as I think it was Admiral Rogers who talked about the fact that, oftentimes they don't even have to make things up. They simply replay. They take kernels of truth. They take existing divisions and weaknesses of our own making and reproduce them, put them out, retweet them indefinitely in a very one-sided way. And so we do have to point those things out. RT Russia Today has a weekly program called America's Lawyer, the unrelenting theme of which, to quote one of the openings, is America's justice system is corrupt and broken. It's been taken over by politicians and the elite for their own corrupt ends. Now, they feature every week stories from our courts all across the country to demonstrate the truth of this statement. I don't think there's anything in there that is a lie, but it is an unrelentingly one-sided view. And so the message we have to convey is, you may agree with what you see in this propaganda, but this propaganda is not there to A, support your cause, and B, if you knew how to look on the other side, you would see that Russia at least is weighing in on both sides. They're not on your side, they're not on the other side, they're on their own side. The objective is not to make us better. It's not to address our race relations problems, to help us address those. It's not to help us resolve immigration debates in this country. It is to weaken us.
Derek, does the Defense Department have a role in helping public awareness of this? This is not necessarily, the Defense Department isn't the tool of choice to get at this.
Exactly.
But they're the most trusted, one of the most trusted agencies in the United States. What's the role? Military officers, do they start speaking to their communities, or does this become politicized as it is now?
They certainly can. I mean, the military and folks in the Pentagon can certainly do that, but I think there's been too much attention, as you suggest, to that part of security. That is part of the problem, I think, is we put too many resources into that kinetic, that hard power side of things, and not enough into State Department or other elements of national power that we have. I mean, during the Cold War, we did mobilize the society. We had to, had to talk about it through NSC 68, et cetera, to get people aware that there was a real challenge from the Soviet Union. The question is, in these days, do we have to have something that is that dramatic in order to get people aware and mobilized for this? I hope not, that we have to go to that length, because it isn't the same as the Cold War. It is something different. But I think we need to resource. I mean, in those days, we had a U.S. information agency. We worked on the information side. We were proactive on shaping ideas about the United States. We recognized that what happened in the world everywhere affected our own security, and we were shaping every day. I think we've gotten complacent. I think we've retreated. I think we're just focused too much on kinetic stuff. We're not resourcing the State Department and our diplomacy well enough. And we're not, and Congress needs to play a greater role in speaking about this, of shining a light on the challenge that we face, and that it isn't quite what we faced before. And that's going to be hard. I think we both have to be adept at addressing it, but also not overreact to it, because that can also undermine what is strong about us, which is confidence in our values, confidence in who we are.
Remain confident. David and Tom, I want you to talk a little bit about what concerns you the most right now today in the gray zone, whether it's a tool or an actor, and then where in the short term and in the long term. So I'm going to have you put your former CIA hat on a little bit. As you were looking out in the landscape, what concerns you the most?
So I will answer that question.
Please do.
I want to answer the last one also, because I think in terms of what government can do to contest sort of info ops, as it were, contesting information space, actually both from my Treasury and from my agency former capacities, I want to just quick thing on that. So one of the things we did at Treasury in our sanctions programs, many of the sanctions programs, were in some respects you can view as designed to contest gray zone activity. So if you think one paradigmatic gray zone activity is using proxies to attack your enemy. Our counterterrorism sanctions program is in part aimed at identifying sanctioning proxies. And we would not just put sanctions on people, we would, quote, name and shame people, right? Part of the sanctions program was to identify who was engaged in illicit behavior, publicize that, and try and get attention to that. So part of what we did at Treasury was to address gray zone activities through the application of sanctions and through publicizing what we were doing.
Sort of that name and shame, expose it, make people not want to deal with it or punish it if they do.
Exactly. So both try to disable it, right? I mean, the principal focus was to try and stop it through the use of financial sanctions, economic sanctions, but there was a public messaging aspect to it as well. To flip it over a little bit to the agency, and I would do this more as a question than as a statement, which is, the CIA has covert action authorities that can be provided by the president. Among the covert action authorities that the agency conceivably could have would be information operations, our own information operations. So not the U.S. Information Agency where it's an overt messaging coming from the U.S., but competing in the info ops space in a covert fashion. I think one of the things that we should think about as a country is whether we want to do that. And if we do that, do we only want to do sort of what we've been talking about, what Suzanne was talking about, amplifying truthful stories, or do we want to contest in the information space with disinformation, which we know our adversaries are doing? And I think it's an interesting question about how we work in the gray zone, both offensively and defensively, particularly in the information operation space. And now I'll answer the question you asked me, which I forget.
Oh, yeah. It was, what concerns you the most right now in the short term in the gray zone? Is it a tactic or an actor or the combination thereof?
So, and this is a little bit because of my own background, what concerns me a lot is the use of covert financial means to gain advantage in the information space. And so I will highlight the New York Times story from this past weekend about what happened in Hungary with a leading website, which had been a neutral and to some extent critical platform addressing the Orban administration. Over time, it was taken over by people who were sympathetic to the administration there. And it didn't quite say this in the article, and I don't know this to be true, but you can imagine that some of the financing that came to buy out that operation came from sources, perhaps Russian sources, but sources who were working to undermine the free expression of ideas. And I think we have seen that. We've seen the Russians use financial support throughout Europe as a way to get their message out in fashion that is, I think, quite worrisome.
Tom, what worries you the most about the gray zone? Tactic, actor?
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to answer both sort of questions together, if I may. So I think in terms of raising public awareness, I think when you say, South China Sea is important, and there's these, Chinese vessels which aren't officially, Navy vessels doing what they're doing, or in Ukraine, you have little green men. I think that doesn't really resonate, right? Because people understand it's important, but they don't really see how it affects them. And our sort of causal logic is that ultimately it will affect them because it will destabilize the periphery, which will destabilize these regions, and it just seems very over there. I think what we need to do is to talk about those issues and topics that affects people directly, because gray zone is not just about the frontier, it's also about this sort of societal clash, right? And to me, there are several directions that would lead in. One of them actually, which David just spoke about, is on the corruption side and the financial side, and I think the other side has effectively weaponized corruption, and there's a necessary response to that, which is shining a spotlight on it pretty systematically. But the one which I think is increasingly the center of gravity is the contest to shape the future of technology. And I know this is something you've talked a lot about here in terms of artificial intelligence and quantum computing and everything. But I think that's the national conversation that we need to be having. That's where the president effectively should be trying to educate the public, and we should be having big debates about Google's decision not to cooperate with the Pentagon on some of these things or other things, and trying to figure out together where best to head, because that I think is really the crux of how a lot of this is going to turn out. And so I would say, focus on the future rather than on the past. Let's talk a little less about the alliances and the roots in the 1940s, much as we love them, and talk about the things that people are going to be concerned about, and really use the awareness tool for things that we haven't really figured out. And that's why I think technology is so important, because people are sort of worried about that. I think it's not just a communications problem for us, it is also a substance problem. We're talking about things that are important, but people, I think, just won't care about enough. And so there are things I think that they will care about and that are also important, so we should shift focus to those.
That's a really great insights. And in a minute, I'm going to turn back to John Schaus. We're going to show you the next video on economic coercion and that weaponization of corruption and the illicit financing. I'm chomping at the bit. That's something that we've focused quite a bit of our research on as well. But before we turn to that, let me ask one final question. And it gets back to your point, David, on sort of counterterrorism. So here's my beef and my riff, and then you can riff back on it. So we are structured since 9/11 to fight terrorism and counterterrorism. In 2016, we had a different event, and we have not done one thing to restructure ourselves. We didn't have a 9/11 commission. We didn't have a November 2016 commission. We haven't, with all due respect to the State Department, Derek, and the Global Engagement Center, no, they're still doing on counterterrorism. They have not been able to adapt to this threat because the gray zone right now, the internal stuff, it falls in the seam between domestic and international. CIA can't do an information operation internally. Who does the information operation to the American people to say you need to be aware of it? Are you trusted? Why? We're not structuring ourselves for success. There's no fusion center. There's no looking at all of these different elements. We're trying to combat it militarily, and this doesn't work militarily. How do we restructure ourselves, and who's going to do it? And when? That's my riff. Who would like it? Silence.
So Heather, you're absolutely right. You've I think, beautifully articulated the problem. It does fall between the seams, and you know, again, I think it's pretty. My frustration is that, in addition to all the things that you say we haven't done, we haven't really had leadership from the White House on the interagency to drive the interagency process in the way that, you know, those of us who've been in government are used to seeing, right? That you would have set up an interagency policy committee at the assistant secretary level. They would have, you know, everyone would have come to the table and shared their knowledge about what was going on and what we should anticipate and what tools and resources and authorities they could bring to address it. They would develop a draft strategic plan for attacking that. It would go up to the deputies and up to the principals, and you'd have a strategic coordinated plan for going forward in which we leverage effectively what everybody can bring to the table. And we really have not seen that. And what we have seen, I do think that men and women across the government are doing their very best to try to address these gray zone activities, and particularly the activities that became so clear in the election of 2016 from Russia and information operations. But they're doing it in silos for the most part. They are hampered in their ability to really effectively work as the interagency. And as you point out, no one has been given the mission to lead this whole of nation, whole of society approach that is required. I do think that all of those departments and agencies, the intelligence community, the military, and DHS and FBI have key roles to play. It's not that any one can take this issue, which is why you need coordination out of the White House typically.
So if it doesn't come from the White House, can it come from Congress? Because I don't think it's going to materialize soon.
So I completely agree with what Suzanne just said, particularly on the lack of leadership from the White House as being the major impediment to dealing with this problem. But so two quick things. So Congress threatened to do something quite significant about election interference. I mean, there was a couple of pieces of legislation that were floating, the Deter Act in particular, which then led the administration actually to adopt a new sanctions program on election interference that you would think was a strong response to dealing with the threat of interference in our elections. If you actually look at that sanctions program, it is the most cockamamie sanctions program you've ever seen.
Cockamamie?
Cockamamie.
Okay.
It is designed, I think, quite deliberately to have the president, unlike any sanctions program I've ever seen, to have the president himself put a stop on the process of imposing sanctions. So the way it works is after the election, the DNI is required to produce a report, I think, in 60 or 90 days. That report then goes to the AG and the Secretary of the Treasury, and then with a recommendation, which then goes to the president for the president to do with what he wants. Most sanctions programs, the authority is created, delegated to Secretary of the Treasury or the Secretary of State to implement the sanctions program. This was designed so that Donald Trump could stop any action taken if there was election interference. And I think that, that is as clear an example of the problem that we confront, which is that what happened in 2016 has not been regarded as an attack on the United States. And so one last thing on my soapbox on this. I have a soapbox on this too. If you look at the intelligence community assessment that was done at the beginning of 2016, and Mike Rogers, who used to be right there, is no longer there, knows this well. The first judgment, high confidence judgment in the intelligence community assessment, wasn't that the Russians were trying to help Hillary Clinton and hurt Donald Trump. It was that the Russians were trying to interfere with American democracy, period, full stop. That's what was the number one leading judgment in the intelligence community assessment. I will tell you, at the time, we thought that would captivate the imagination of the American public.
It didn't.
And it didn't. And it didn't for reasons I think are probably apparent to everybody. But it was an enormous missed opportunity to take the intelligence community's consolidated judgment on what had happened in the 2016 election and to use that as a jumping off point, like 9/11 was a jumping off point to do something about it. And as a country, we did not.
I think one of the challenges, just finally, is that the gray zone is difficult to define, and it's so wide. I mean, it runs from what happened to our elections, to what's happening in the South China Sea, to what's happening with Belt and Road, with infrastructure globally, and our values in those ways. There are some strands that run through them in terms of values and norms and standards, which I do think is the defining issue of our time. What are the rules, the standards, the norms, the laws that will govern international conduct in the 21st century, with the rise of big powers? So there is a competition of ideas, some of which is being engaged in shadowy ways, some which is done, publicly. But trying to get your arm around that big issue with all these different strands can be a challenge. But certainly, I think you do need to organize at the White House level and get Congress to be thinking about these things and to be shining a light that we do have a problem here. And I'm not sure 3 or 4 years ago that we were focused on it like this. So now we are recognizing there's a problem, which is the first step, they always say, to solving it.
It is the first step, but we can't wait 60, 90 days and the wait, because the gray zone actors are adapting as well. Tom, do you have any thoughts on structure, or we'll go straight to watching another video?
I'm going to go to the video.
You want to go to the video? All right, let's go to the film. Mr. Schaus, take it away.
Thank you, Heather. Joe, can you play the video?
The global economic order is changing. As economic power spreads to more countries, some are using their newfound strength to step outside existing rules and norms of the global free market. They are engaging in economic coercion, from intellectual property theft to outright economic punishment.
We spent a lot of time focusing on Russian economic influence. So illicit financing, money laundering, corruption, and where those economic levers are then used to influence the politics, the politicians, the political parties, purchasing media companies to amplify pro-Kremlin messages.
China has used non-transparent coercion against whether it's American companies that have done things that are considered to be problematic from China's point of view. American companies are being tacitly discriminated against through, let's say, the anti-monopoly authorities coming in and raiding an American company's offices in Beijing.
As Russia, China, Iran, and others seek to fracture or replace ties to the United States, U.S. allies and partners have increasingly found themselves the target of economic coercion.
The way China is using Belt and Road and Maritime Silk Road is by creating a classic dependency. China is offering a lot of money with very few conditions that you know about before you sign the contract to places that need infrastructure. The Chinese orchestrated a massive embargo of South Korean goods, especially Lotte, because Lotte was leasing the land for the American Terminal High Altitude Air Defense THAAD system, which was necessary to defend our guys and South Korean troops and civilians from North Korean nuclear weapons and missiles.
The United States itself has turned increasingly to economic sanctions as a tool of statecraft. More recently, it began using tariffs to respond to unfair trade practices by other countries. Companies, Main Street businesses, and everyday consumers are increasingly caught in this intensifying economic competition. At stake may be the future of the global free market.
So that was a brief video about one of the tools or tactics in the gray zone, which we call economic coercion. We have other videos that we'll post online shortly, and we'll send out a note to encourage everybody to look at them, things like ambiguous forces or disinformation. But for today's discussion, we wanted to focus just on one of these tools because we only have so much time. But again, we want to get your thoughts. So please pull out your iClickers, make sure the green light is on, and we have a question, 2 questions. So how much are you affected by economic coercion aimed at U.S. allies or partners? Go ahead, Joe. Voting is open. We have a lot of conscientious objectors here to the voting process. I'm very impressed at the consistency. But there's a pretty clear leader in that. Also, pretty interesting. Maybe about 5 more seconds for those of you whose devices took a second to fire up. All right, Joe, can you close this one and go to the next? So the next question, wait to vote until the screen goes blank. How does a global economic system ordered on the free market affect you or your family? Very negatively, somewhat positively, or very positively. You can't be a fence sitter. We didn't give you a C, right in the middle. All right. All right, Joe, let's close the voting on this. Heather, I'll throw it back to you for further discussion, and I will be back with you all for one more video.
John, so much. So I'm so grateful that we have focused our conversation a bit on economic coercion because we have some really fantastic insights on the panel. So my little phrase for this, if you can't beat it, buy it. And I think what surprised me is how much is for sale, both through our institutions, our economic interests, and in some ways this plays, for me, economic coercion and the illicit financing, the corruption, that is a strength of neo-authoritarians and a weakness of ours, our transparency, our openness, our rules, and how those rules are then used to harm ourselves. So this is the, what I call it, there's a home and away game. This is the home game. And it's working internally, and it's working very well. David, I want to start with you because you have seen this so much from your time at the Treasury Department and focusing on, I think, FinCEN, the Financial Intelligence Network, you know, from the Panama Papers to the Paradise Papers, we know authoritarian regimes live off of illicit financing and corruption. And it infests itself in Western systems to allow them to do that. The Danske Bank, ABLV Bank, Deutsche Bank, the banking system, the financial structure is part of this. They're trying to fight it, but boy, we still have a long way to go. Help us understand how the adversary uses this, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more amongst the panel about sanctions and other tools to fight against it.
Look, I mean, the old aphorism that money makes the world go round applies both in legitimate world and in the illicit world. And so what our adversaries do, and we talked about this a little bit, is to use money often in covert ways, but often not so covertly.
Not so covert.
To advance their interests, whether it's by buying media companies, by buying government officials, through buying business opportunities through corrupt practices. that we see it is endemic, right? It is basically everywhere. It's in the United States. It's outside the United States. We have, I think, done a pretty good job of trying to combat that through the effort to export financial transparency around the world. So one of the things that we did at Treasury, FinCEN in particular, but also the Treasury Department more generally, was to promote good financial practices around the world through an organization called the Financial Action Task Force, which sets out standards for how countries ought to organize their financial system. It's all designed to bring transparency to the financial system, which is sort of the first step to identify illicit financial practices, whether it's for corruption or for other means. If you look back 20 years, compare that to where we are today, I think we made extraordinary strides on that, and it has helped to combat corruption. The one other thing that we've done as a country, which I think has been useful, and occasionally you get grumbling from U.S. business, and occasionally you get grumbling from our current president on this, is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which sets out as a very clear policy of the United States that we're not going to allow U.S. businesses or anybody who sort of touches the U.S. economy to use bribery as a way to get economic advantage around the world. That has also helped to sort of clean up the international business sector. Recent sanctions program, the Global Magnitsky Act, also has corruption as one of the prongs on which someone can be, one of the bases on which someone can be sanctioned, is if they are involved in corruption. So I think we are trying to combat corruption, illicit finance in a variety of ways around the world. I think it has helped to clean up the world a little bit, but there's a lot yet to be done.
Derek, China has a very different approach to Belt and Road, and you've certainly watched that very closely in countries. We're seeing the debt trap concerns, the lack of transparency. Help us understand how China uses their economic power.
Well, I think China has a fundamental belief that any country can be bought. That really money does make the world go round. And if you put enough money towards it, they can buy off their own people. They can buy off foreign countries and businesses. If people make money, then they'll be quiet. And if you withdraw, if you say you can't get access to our great market, then they will also be coerced not to do things that they otherwise might do. I'm not sure that, and we're seeing this in many countries, that may not be true. This is still playing itself out. You say countries can be bought and sold, maybe they can be rented for a time, but countries have sovereignty. Individuals can be bought, maybe some leaders can be bought because it's in their interest to get money in, to get infrastructure, or to get support for corruption that keeps them in power. But China is doing this around the world. They're putting out contracts. They're trying to say, look, we have money to offer you for infrastructure, and countries need that. We shouldn't be in the position of being against China going around the world offering infrastructure development. What it is about the rules and the norms. What are the details of those contracts? How are they going about doing this? And this is where, again, I think we are this is our strength. We talk about transparency. Most countries, most citizens around the world want to know what is happening on their soil, if it's going to affect them well or not. The leadership does not, of course. And China will appeal to autocrats around the world. What we appeal to are the billions of people that want to know, is this actually going to help us through our environmental or social impacts? And we need to be empowering those people to be able to take charge of their own countries. And this is a little bit of a pitch for what I do now, because this is what NDI does. It's not, and we're in the open, the other guys, Russia and China, will work in the shadows and try and subvert and use misinformation. And we're simply about allowing people to be empowered to make decisions for themselves. And I think in the competition for ideas, we win that. Absolutely. Around the world. This is our strength. This is where we should be confident. And this is where we should be thinking smartly about, there may be a place for covert stuff here or there. There always is. But we should be very careful as well to think about where our strength is to empower people to make decisions for themselves. And that will push back against the Chinese so-called threat, which is not necessarily infrastructure. It's not necessarily Belt and Road as an idea of developing folks because they have money they want to use, But it's how, not the what, that we should be thinking about and trying to shape not just what we do, but helping others to be empowered to do it as well.
Suzanne, how's the economic space look from your vantage point?
Well, I want to pick up on this transparency point that's been made several times by really everybody up here, and the notion that really what we always need to do is play to our strengths and our adversaries' weaknesses. And there is nothing more glaring, I think, in that fits that context than transparency. And both because it is a strength that is compelling to populations, but it also because it is the way the world is going. Transparent world is coming at us full steam ahead, and there is no stopping it. And who is better prepared to deal with a transparent world, us or Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran? Right? And so I talk about it in terms of training to fight in the light. If you train to fight in the dark, you could meet your adversary at night or turn off the light and you'd have the advantage. We need to constantly be training to fight in the light. Take advantage of the incredible head start that we have on our adversaries in dealing with this transparent world and go around the world turning on the lights. Whether that is by providing information that empowers people to be actively engaged in what's going on in their country, or it could be in information operations that get the truth out there about financial holdings of corrupt politicians in these countries. But all of our adversaries count on, for regime preservation, keeping secrets, primarily from their own population. And our strength is that, at least historically and traditionally, our government does not.
Tom, your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
just three quick observations. The first is, I think the reason we're in this is that we, the West, the US, Europe, Japan, built open economic order after the Cold War that included everyone with unprecedented levels of interdependence and integration, and that the underlying assumption was that all of the major stakeholders in that would be, if not friendly, would be cooperative, right? That the interests that we held in common would be more important than the differences between us. And of course, it didn't turn out that way. And so some of the key powers, particularly the second largest economy, China, is a rival or a competitor, or however you put it. It's not, Germany or France or Japan, right? And that, I think, changes everything, because now we're in an unprecedented level of interdependence, and we're each trying to figure out how to use that interdependence to exploit each other's vulnerabilities. So what leverage does it give us? And I think we're only at the beginning of actually figuring out that there's a lot that each side can do. And so I think it is quite worrying where this will head. And I think this is a sign of the future. The second observation is that, and as someone made this point earlier, that China wants to buy other countries. Well, size matters in that, and the smaller the country, the more vulnerable it is. And I think this is particularly true in Europe, where we see China very active in Central and Eastern Europe, whereby there will be negotiations and the translator will be provided by the Chinese side, because there's literally no one in the country who speaks Chinese, or or the Chinese experts are from the Confucius Institute, which is supplied by Beijing. So there's a huge capacity gap there. And so I think it's increasingly important that allies hang together. And it's unfortunate, I think, that the Trump administration has or the president himself has turned down European overtures to work together on China. I think working on these issues is an important part of the alliances, even outside of the regions involved. And the final observation is just on what it means in terms of vulnerability of the system, because in 2008-09, when we were hit with a financial crisis, according to Hank Paulson, the Russians went to the Chinese and suggested trying to collapse part of the U.S. Housing sector, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the Chinese said no and informed the Americans immediately. Will that be true in the future? Will countries basically cooperate to uphold the system? out of a mutual interest if it occurs again, or will they try to exploit each other's weakness? And if it's the latter, I think we are looking, if there is a systemic risk of the kind in 08, 09, much more along a 1930s style response than a 2000 style response. And that, I think, is a big strategic vulnerability as well.
That's just an interesting reflection. Talk about the two very different strategies of Russia and China in the gray zone. Russia has an immediacy to bring down the system to then recreate sort of a new condominium, if you will, with the US. The Chinese need the system to be stable, but in a different approach. So talk about, in just that one example, really striking two very different time sets. Let me just, before we finish the economic coercion conversation, David, I'm going to start with you again as sort of a concern I have because we don't want to talk about this as war and our tools are very limited in the gray zone, and when those rules and norms are broken, we turn to sanctions, whether it's chemical weapons use, human rights abuses, nuclear weapons, you name it. And we've used this tool time and time again, and the power of the American economic and financial system. Now we're starting to see where there's just resistance growing, parallel structures that the Chinese and Russians are suggesting, even the European Union now with the special purpose vehicle. The use of this tool has now created where they're like, I get it, we will just hive off so we can't be harmed, these separate structures. There's coming a point now, it's like drug resistance, they're resistant to these sanctions. Is this a concern that you have? What are the other tools? Because if the sanctions aren't doing it, and we don't, short of warfare, what other tools do we have to push against the violations of norms, rules, you name it?
So I think the demise of the sanctions tool as an effective part of our arsenal is a little bit overstated.
Okay.
And so I would distinguish between situations where sanctions work well because you have a clearly articulated policy, it's part of a broader sort of whole of government approach, and you have a target that is susceptible to the sanctions tool, versus using the sanctions tool in a situation where you don't have a clear policy and there's sort of no good surface area of attack, essentially, on what you're trying to use. And we've used sanctions in both situations. And so one situation where we have tried to use sanctions, I think without great effect, is in the gray zone to combat malicious cyber activity. So after the Sony hack, we put in place a sanctions program aimed at malicious cyber activity. But it doesn't work very well because by and large, malicious cyber actors are, these sort of kids in the basement, essentially, that can recreate what they're doing elsewhere. And they're not susceptible to, they don't have assets in the US, they're not susceptible to the US financial system. So I think fundamentally, the use of economic tools, whether it's ours or the Chinese, is a question of dependency, right? The reason that our financial sanctions work in some instances is because there are those who are dependent on the US financial system. I don't see that changing anytime soon. And although I think it's a concern, I think it's a little bit of an overblown concern that this is going to lead to the demise of the US financial system or the decline of the dollar as the global reserve currency. But you look on the Chinese side, so a lot of what we've been talking about is that they use their size, their wealth, and the need for others to sort of depend on the Chinese as a tool of economic coercion. So one very quick example. About 5 years ago the Japanese and the Chinese got into a little bit of a tussle over some fishing vessels that the Japanese seized. The Chinese cut off rare earth minerals to Japan as a way to coerce the Japanese into releasing these fishing vessels of the Chinese, which were actually not fishing vessels. But it was because Japan was dependent on Chinese rare earth minerals that they were able to use their economic coercion to get their objective achieved. And I think Tom's exactly right. We are going to see more and more of the Chinese recognizing that they have others depending on them in a way that will then create economic leverage that you'll see play out over the next decades, I'd say.
Derek, how do you view sort of what has been effective, particularly in the China example, of our use of either sanctions or economic power to help alter behavior? Has it really not had much of an effect?
I'm not
As
sure.
a former ambassador to Myanmar, you actually have
Well, there you go.
an interesting perspective.
That's
on this
right.
also.
Yes, well, I can take that angle of it. I mean, I'm not sure, just to answer the first question on sanctions and how we have used sanctions. I don't know that we've used that tool with China. I mean, it's always been about engagement and working with them and trying to shape them, and we haven't thought until recently, now we're really knee deep in coercion through tariffs, et cetera, to try to demonstrate that actually we have maybe more power than they do, that they don't have us over a barrel. We may have, I'm not agreeing with the policy entirely, but that we may have more leverage than we've always realized or decided to use. So when it comes to China, I'm not sure that we have done a lot of that. But if you want to get to the Burma example, it gets to what I was talking about before, which is the competition of norms and values. And that's what it was in Burma. If people would say, well, you must have been in Burma and it was a whole China strategy. You were trying to, kick China out, or it was a geopolitical thing. And I'll tell you honestly, I never thought a day really about China in that job. But it was about, and I used to have this conversation with the Indians, the only way you can actually compete with China there is to change the battlefield in a way and to make it a more open system where they have more agency, people have more ability to speak for themselves, it's a more open system, and therefore they will ask for social and environmental standards. That works for us, what we were talking about. That is our battlefield, that is our strength, not China's. And if you're working in the shadows, if you're trying to work in a dark area of corruption and military domination, we can't compete in that. So the moment I realized we were prevailing in a way, if you want to think about it, over China and Burma, was when the Chinese ambassador said publicly, we need to do CSR. I knew, it's corporate social responsibility. I knew they had no idea what that meant. They thought that was passing around money. That's what they thought it was. Buy people off. And the Burmese were saying, no, that's not what we want. We want you to be responsible stewards of our environment. We want you to talk to us. We want you to be transparent. We want to have a say in these contracts. That's a competition that, again, we can win, and is actually, in the Chinese parlance, win-win. It works for everybody except maybe China, because that's not how they work. So trying to shape the way they do things. It's not whether they do these things, it's how they do these things that really should matter most to us. So our economic engagement should, in the way we coerce them back, is to force them to come into the light, to have to really compete and to have to answer to local populations, and then in that way we compete on a more level playing field.
Tom, I wonder, I'm just thinking, the challenge of sanctions, and my example is the European Union's sanctions against Russia that they've held for 4+ years. But you often hear some leaders suggest that, the sanctions aren't working, they're not changing Russia's behavior, and they're punishing our businesses, our economic health. Sanctions in some ways is self-sacrificing for those norms and values. You are self-punishing because you're prohibiting your businesses from carrying out trade, but you're doing it for a higher purpose. What's your sense in how the Europeans in the long term view sanctions? They've both used them towards Russia, but they've also felt the impact of U.S. secondary sanctions now, certainly with Iran. What's our closest allies and partners? How would they view sanctions?
Right. I mean, the expectation has been that the support for sanctions against Russia would collapse, right? People believed it would collapse a couple of years ago, and it didn't. And when Trump was elected, they definitely thought it would collapse because they thought it was the U.S. basically keeping them in line, and it hasn't. And so I think there will always be grumbling, but it's a bit more, especially with Merkel, we'll see what happens when she steps down. But I think it is a bit more stable than it sometimes appears. I think there is and they don't like the secondary sanctions for sure because they feel that's a violation of their sovereignty, but they tolerate it, I think. And that raises an interesting question for Treasury, which is how much to use it, like what's the break point at which is too much. But I think there is a larger sort of strategic question governing all of this, which is how interdependent do we want to be over the medium to long term with Russia, China, and others? And is it actually a good thing sort of to encourage the levels of commercial engagement? I mean, the Russians have taken a decision that it's a bad idea from their point of view, and Putin believes that he wants his country to be more inoculated from the West, because if he's dependent on Western financial systems, that makes him very vulnerable. I don't think we should go there, and I don't think that's an appropriate response, but I do think there are certain areas where we are interdependent that we need to think not just economically about, and also strategically, and say, would it be a good thing for both sides if we sort of pull back a bit? It's not decoupling, but it is sort of a recalibration, and sanctions, one of the secondary effects of it may be to push that sort of recalibration a little further. But I think it's, especially with China, we do need to sort of work with the private sector in particular, and especially on the financial dependence side, to figure out how much exposure is strategically acceptable.
So we're going to invite John Schaus up, and we'll do another video to close us out. But if I may probably do a very poor job of trying to summarize some really great insights. Hashtag fight in the light, which will be our new gray zone. It's doing what we've always done, but we've forgotten. Our weapons are our truth, our transparency, the dignity of the individual, empowering that individual and civil society. We know the values, we know the norms, we know what to do. We've just tried to take a lot of shortcuts and maybe hope it didn't work. That's an offensive strategy, it's a defensive strategy. In some ways, there's not a magic formula about being competitive in the gray zone. It's doing what we know what we need to do, but all of us embracing it and living it out daily, domestically, and fighting for those institutions and that democracy and holding that up and fighting for it internationally. So maybe this doesn't take a whole big rethink, but it takes us getting back to where we were. Thank you all so much. This was a fantastic conversation. And now, absent the popcorn, we have one more video for you. Mr. Schaus, take it away.
Thank you, Heather. So we've touched on a lot of these themes already, but for our last video, we want to look at how to think about solutions. What can we actually do, and how do we work through this together? So Joe, last video, please.
Gray zone conflict is increasingly defining 21st century geopolitical competition, and it's challenging our ability to protect U.S. interests.
The system of rules and norms that we've constructed and helped safeguard over the years is very much under threat from gray zone activities.
If we fail to recognize that other countries like China, are getting very good at sort of pushing on levers in places where the U.S. isn't particularly focused, then that's going to be a problem for U.S. foreign policy in the long run.
The United States is only beginning to consider how best to respond to these types of threats.
This fight is for the American mind, and that's where we have to start the fight. The battle space is our democracy, and how do we help prepare individuals who don't think of themselves on a battlefield, whether that's information or their opinions? That's where the action is taking place.
Responding effectively to gray zone threats begins by fully understanding the capabilities, intent, and actions already underway by adversaries.
Like, you have to start connecting dots. It's not one incident per se, but a series of activities that one has to start to piece together.
No one is really collecting all of these dots systematically, and if you don't collect the dots, you can't connect the dots.
An effective U.S. response also requires articulating at home and abroad what rules and values the United States will defend.
As long as people of goodwill and courage refuse to lose faith in the West, it will endure.
What is going to be essential is for the United States and our NATO partners to start defining behavior in the gray zone. We're going to have to create the international norms, have declarative policy about those norms, and then enforce those norms with punishment.
I don't think we can do any of this alone, really, but we certainly are the only country that could walk into a group of allies and partners and say, look, here's what we think we ought to do, and let's put some ideas on the table.
That is not just a whole of government effort, that has to be a whole of society effort. But it does mean that as we try to operate in an open political and economic model, we do so mindful of the threats that we face, and we pull together as a country.
So that's one way to think about how do we go about generating solutions and actions that we can take to address these kinds of problems. For our last poll section, please pull out your iClickers, make sure the green light is on. Joe, next slide, please. 2 more questions. Thinking about how should the United States respond? And so this is a little bit more complicated. What incident should the United States consider responding to with military force? Go ahead, Joe. Fake news, personal data theft, destructive cyber attack, or proxies attacking U.S. forces. You only get to pick one. Not surprising. Okay, Joe, can we close this one and we'll go to the next slide. And open this poll. How do you think the United States should respond to economic coercion? Should we retaliate in kind, escalate using other means, such as cyber attacks? Should we enact sanctions on the aggressing state, or rely on international or multilateral organizations to build a coalition to enforce the rules? That last option takes a lot of time to read. I will say I didn't expect that preponderant of a response on this one, so that's very intriguing. Thank you all. This has been a fascinating conversation for me. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please join me in thanking Heather and our panel, and the rest of the ISP team and the conferencing team who made all of this possible. This has been a wonderful event. We will have more information online soon, and we will share it with you at that point. Thank you.